Good morning, viewers. So I've just arrived at the bike shed Scramble. I've come with mate Tim. I'm on the Triumph, hoping it will redeem itself after last week's issues. However, I've got here and it's not entirely what I expected. I appear to be a little bit outgunned. I don't know how serious this is going to get, but we've got CRFs, we've got motocross bikes, enduro bikes, and not an awful lot of rusty old Triumphs. So yeah, I suppose we're just going to give it my best shot. I'm hoping there'll be a stream crossing or something like that, because I like doing those, and hopefully the bike just behaves itself after the Malay catastrophe. The place looks pretty good. It's been really wet. The forecast is not good for today, so we might be getting a little bit wet and muddy, but we'll see. Well, just had my safety briefing and I'm wondering what the hell I've got myself into. Turns out I'm at a full-blown enduro track on a 1962 Triumph. So I think I'll stick with Tim, who's also on his Triumph, and we'll see how we get along. No worries. And honestly, I'm bricking it. I've got no idea what they got in store for us. This could be interesting. This is going to be interesting. Apparently orange route is easy, green is hard, which is counterintuitive. This could be very interesting. My word. Oh my word. At this point it's like, do I try and go through, or do I just... Oh. Tim's face says it all, doesn't it? I think there's going to be a lot of paddling. Oh, you're kidding! Snap the cable.
You got a spare one?
Nope.
You got a spare?
Nope.
Alright.
Snap my clutch. Cheers, guys. And so that was that. This video has very quickly gone from a riding video to a workshop video because I need to repair it. But first of all, let's talk about what actually happened. So the cable didn't actually snap. The solder on the nipple just pulled straight through, which doesn't happen very often. It was more just bad luck. I've had 2 years out of that cable. It's been well maintained. It was probably coming. So what could I've actually done to continue with my day riding? Well, I could have put an emergency cable nipple on there. My friend Simon actually had some. I turned them down because, to be honest, they don't hold that well. And looking at the conditions of that track, it was going to be a pretty clutch heavy ride, I would imagine. Basically, we all turned up expecting a light Sunday scramble and were presented with something that probably should have been done on an enduro bike. In fact, there were people doing it on enduro bikes and they were struggling. So maybe the cable breakage was our saving grace, I don't know. The other thing I could have done is I could have had a spare cable. Now, the reason I actually haven't carried a spare cable around before is because changing one on the Triumph is quite involved. You actually have to take off the gearbox cover, which involves taking off other bits and bobs, and it's quite a long job. In the future, I will carry a spare because it is something I can do in an absolute emergency. But now I need to make a new cable. So the problem with the cable I had on there, which is this one, is that it pulled through the nipple. The solder just gave up the ghost and off it went. Now there is something you can do to make that less likely to happen, and that involves having a special tool, which Venhill make. It's expensive, I don't have that money, so I'm going to be making one. And basically what that does is usually you will fray the end of this so that when you fill the nipple up with solder, that'll swell out and it should discourage it from pulling through. This tool I'm going to make today actually puts in like a neat little ball. This cable is quite hard stuff to bend, so this is in some way a mould that will swell out the end of the cable, and that should be a much stronger way of doing it. I've wanted one for a while. This has finally given me a kick up the bum to make one. So in order to make this tool, I'm going to need 2 right-angled pieces of steel, which I've got here. This isn't standard right-angled steel. So with standard stuff, basically you have this rounded edge here on the inside, you'll also have it repeated on the outside. This has actually got a sharp edge on the outside, which is what we want. This tool basically involves putting these 2 pieces together, and then you'll have a hole through the middle that clamps the cable, and then you'll also have a larger one that you can put a punch into and just give a bash on the end, and hopefully that will mould the cable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill directly down there and do a 3mm hole, which should hopefully clamp my new cable. And then on top of that hole, I'm basically going to recess it with a slightly larger hole, which should allow me to get my punch in there, and then I can create that nice little ball on the end of the cable. So I finished up on my birdcage tool, basically drilling out in between 2 pieces with a small drill bit is quite a difficult thing to do. So I actually used a larger drill bit first just to centre it and start it off, and to my surprise it worked perfectly. So they are totally even. I've also run them across the linisher as well, just to make them nice and flat, so that when I clamp them together the surfaces meet nicely. So the idea here is to just clamp the cable in between the smaller groove, a little bit poking out the top, and then the punch would go in there and bam, on top of the cable, hopefully making an irreversible shape. So now we've got that done, we need to move on to actually making the cable. So why would you make a cable when they are so cheap? Well, a lot of the time you order stuff for older bikes, it turns up it's not quite right. I don't know why that is. Surely in this day and age we should be making stuff better than it was back then, but that doesn't always seem to be the case. Another thing is determining the length of your cables. I personally, when I didn't make cables, I've ordered cables before and they turn up, they look way too long. They fit, but they look ridiculous. So it's nice to be able to make them the length you want. And the final thing really is working with custom bikes. If you're putting different handlebars on there and things like that, then quite quickly you'll find that the standard cables won't fit. And you might have a hard time finding another cable that will. So it's much easier to just learn how to make them yourself. So when it comes to actually making them, I use the Venhill cable kit. There's a universal clutch kit and there's a universal throttle kit. So today we'll be working with the clutch kit. They supply the inner cable, the outer cable, any ferrules, any fittings, nipples, all that lot is included, and they're very good. First thing I need to do is determine what length I want the cables. Now, I'm lucky because I've got the old cable, so I can just measure them up next to it and I cut them off and do it that way. When you've got to measure it yourself, it does get slightly more complex, but not by a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my cables, and I'm also going to put the little protective ferrules on the end of our outer wire. Right, so cable's coming along nicely. Now I need to attach the nipples. So what I need to do is I need to thread them onto both ends before I use my new tool. And that is because if I use it before, I won't be able to thread them over. So I'm going to pop them on, check they're around the right way, and then I'll take the new tool over to the vise and see whether it's going to work or not. Well, the tool actually worked surprisingly well. Not quite as well as the Venhill tool. Basically, the Venhill tool is called the birdcage tool because the shape it makes out of the wire is similar to a birdcage in the fact that it's a little wire ball like that. Mine doesn't do a ball, it seems to do a dome. I suspect if I made a punch that actually had a dome in it, it probably would do the birdcage. But I think basically that's going to do us. When you compare the shape that this makes in comparison to just fraying the end, I'm pretty certain this has got to be a better thing. So now it comes to actually permanently attaching these fittings, and the way I do that is by soldering them. Now there are lots of different ways to do this. The way I personally do it is with a large soldering iron. With a small electrical soldering iron you won't get there, so I've got one about that size. It gets very, very hot. Some people will use gas. I have used gas in the past. The reason I don't get along with it is because this wire can be quite tricky to do. If you get it too hot, it becomes very brittle and it also becomes impossible to solder. And I found that that was much more likely using the gas. So whilst it takes a little bit longer, I get along much better with the soldering iron. Another thing I sometimes use is like a little crocodile clip set up because that just holds everything in place quite nicely. So yeah, just plumber's solder, and I'm going to solder them in now. So that is the cable pretty much done. The soldering went well. The only thing I did do was run around with a file and just clean up any of the excess solder that kind of gets in the way. Now there are a couple of things you can do to kind of lengthen the life of your cables. One of those is to oil them. You've got to oil them. These are nylon lined cables, which helps the inner cable to move up and down nicely, but you've got to keep on top of the oil as well. You don't want to put too much pressure on these little pieces. The other thing is, because we've soldered this, we've used flux. Flux is an acid, and if we leave that on there over time, it will deteriorate the cable. So what I tend to do is I make up a baking soda and water paste, I'll put it on there, and that will kind of neutralise it. Then I'll rinse it all off with water, and then that should just help to give your cables a bit of a fighting chance. So as I said, I'm going to be carrying a spare cable around from now on. I honestly can't believe the luck I've had with the past two events. It's just unfathomable. It's just tiny little jobs, you know. It could have happened to any bike that the valve ripped out. It could have happened to any bike that the cable went. It's just the way it goes sometimes. So yeah, I'm not too sore about it. Hopefully the next event I go to, I won't break down. That might tip me over the edge if it does. But I've just hit 500 subscribers. And I really, really appreciate them. I really do. So thank you very much to you guys. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for commenting. And keep it up because I love to hear from you guys. I like to interact with you and see what you think of the video. So a massive thank you to you lot, and I'll see you next week.